Hi everyone, welcome to our first asynchronous lecture for Econ 201, our intermediate micro class. And today we're really going to be going over the basics of supply and demand. And since you all have had Econ 101 already, we're going to go a little quickly with this lecture. We're going to presume that you know these basics, so it should be mostly review. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, supply and demand is really the sort of fundamental tool that we're going to be using in econ, not only in 201, but throughout your career as an economist. And what we do this semester is either unpack the fundamentals that underlie supply and demand, or go deep into the implications that these models have on our modes of analysis. So that means predicting how changing economic conditions can affect market price and production. It means evaluating the impact of controls in the market, whether they be price controls or price supports or incentives to produce. And it means determining how these various market interventions like taxes and subsidies are going to affect both us as consumers and also suppliers and the production chain. So with that in mind, let's start with supply. And remember that supply is a relationship. Supply is a relationship, demand is a relationship. And the two variables that this relationship is relating is quantity supplied and price of the good. And here let's take a minute to underscore something that you all know by now, but supply is fundamentally different than quantity supplied. Quantity supplied is a variable, supply is a relationship that describes what happens to that variable quantity supplied. And what does this relationship mean? It is the relationship between the price of a good and how much quantity that producers are willing and able to bring to market at that given price. You all are suppliers. One of the many things that you supply in the marketplace is your labor. So think about your own relationship, quantity supplied, how much quantity you are willing to supply at given prices. Typically, when prices are higher, suppliers want to supply greater quantity. So when the price of labor, a wage, is higher, you guys are more induced to work. We can represent this relationship graphically with a supply curve. Supply curves are upward sloping. Supply to the sky. And I'll take a minute to grab my pen and draw that upward sloping arrow. Supply to the sky, supply curves are upward sloping. And what this curve shows is that relationship, how the quantity of a good changes as the price of the good changes. And remember here, we're differentiating the relationship supply with the variable quantity supplied. So the relationship only depends on those two variables, price and quantity. We explore this using our modeling technique, our thought experiment, ceteris paribus, all else equal. But of course, as we know, all else is not equal, and sometimes things outside that relationship change. For instance, production costs. So if production costs change, if production costs in this example fall, then firms can produce the same quantity at a lower price or a larger quantity at the same price. In other words, they're willing to bring more to market at any given price, and the supply curve will shift out, in this case from S to S prime. So supply is a relationship relating price and quantity, but there are things outside that relationship that will change. For instance, production costs, number of sellers in the marketplace, technology, governmental policies, and the prices of related goods. This is all review of what we learned in Econ 101. Demand is also a relationship. Demand relates to variables, price and quantity demanded. And you are all demanders. So when we think about demand, think about your own role in the marketplace. And think about how your individual quantity demanded changes when prices change. When prices go lower, people typically demand a greater quantity. For instance, I bought 2 new televisions this summer because TVs were particularly cheap. What this relationship looks like graphically is a downward sloping curve, demand to the land. And just like with supply, there are things outside this relationship which change our underlying relation between price and quantity. For instance, how much money we're making. With most goods, we call these goods normal goods. When people earn a higher income, they tend to demand a greater quantity at any given price. In this case, it looks graphically like the demand curve shifting out, here from D to D prime. There are many things that might shift our demand curve, including the price of related goods. Here we describe substitutes and complements. Substitutes are 2 goods for which an increase in price of one leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of the other. So P1 up applies Q2 up. Here, think if hamburgers are more expensive, we might shift our demand to a greater quantity of hot dogs. Complements are 2 goods where an increase in the price of one leads to a decrease in the quantity of the other, Q2 down. So here we might think if the price of peanut butter goes up, we demand a smaller quantity of jelly. Now remember that related goods are not the only thing which shift our demand curve. We can also think of tastes and expectations. We can think of the number of consumers in the marketplace. We can think of lots of different reasons why our underlying relationship, demand, might shift either in or out. And again, this is all just review from what you know from Econ 101. And finally, when these 2 relationships, the supply relationship and the demand relationship, interact, what we have is a market. A market is a collection of buyers and sellers coming together to negotiate over price and quantity of goods and services. And the market clears at a particular price. At that price, a market clearing price, we have the quantity supplied equal to the quantity demanded, in this case at Q0. Sometimes the price is higher than the market clearing price. In this case, at a higher price P1, we have a surplus, where suppliers want to supply more than demanders want to purchase. Quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, so there is excess goods. What do suppliers do with these excess goods? They lower the price, they put them on sale. Thus the price falls, hopefully eventually to a market clearing price, in this case P0. Similarly, when prices are too low, in this case at P sub 2, we have a shortage. A shortage is where quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. Suppliers at such low prices can't keep their goods on the shelves. So what happens? Consumers, demanders, outbid one another until the price goes up to that market clearing, that equilibrium price P0. Turning our attention to the graph, what we see is quantity on the x-axis and price in dollars per unit on the y-axis, an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. The price at which they intersect is P0 at a quantity Q0. We have these horizontal lines at prices P1 and P2 intersecting the supply and demand curves at different places. In the case of P1, developing a surplus, and in the case of P2, developing a shortage. And what those are the gaps between the curves. So just to reiterate in text, the equilibrium, the balance condition in our market mechanism, is the price where the market clears, the price that equates quantity supplied to quantity demanded. The equilibrium price is the price where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And in a free and competitive market, so think about how frictions in the marketplace might change this tendency, but in a free and competitive market, the market tends to engage in price changes tâtonnement, which Walras referred to as the invisible auctioneer, which Adam Smith referred to as the invisible hand. This process of price changes such that the price will change until we reach a market clearing price. What this means is the market is not always in equilibrium. It's not always at a market clearing price. We might have a situation where we have excess quantity demanded. We might be in a situation where we have excess quantity supplied. Our question is, what happens to ameliorate these situations? What happens to get these situations to equilibrium? And what we'll see, again, in a free and competitive market is that price changes take place. But remember, markets are dynamic constructs, so things change. For instance, ships and supplies change. So what happens if, for instance, we have an increase in technology, allowing suppliers to bring greater quantity to the market at any given price? Supply will shift out, lowering equilibrium price and raising equilibrium quantity. Similarly, what happens if taste and preferences change, inducing consumers to demand a greater quantity at any given price? Well, demand will shift out, inducing a greater equilibrium price and a greater equilibrium quantity. And forgive my E pen there, it messed up a little bit, but it's supposed to be an up arrow for greater equilibrium price. We can also have concurrent changes where perhaps input costs are lower, shifting supply out, and there are more consumers in a market, shifting demand out. So what happens in this case? Well, with the increase in both supply and demand, by which I mean the relationships, the underlying relationship, equilibrium quantity unambiguously goes up, in this case from Q1 to Q2. What happens to equilibrium price? Here we see a small increase, but in general, when both supply and demand shift out, we don't know what happens to equilibrium price. We need more information. And on your own, you should review what happens when there are concurrent changes in all possible forms. Either supply and demand both increase, supply increases and demand decreases, supply and demand both decrease, or supply decreases but demand increases. So on your own, take a minute to confirm what happens to both equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in these situations.